Mr. McKinney and Mrs. Lang were involved in a collision on August 7, 2012. They both claim they are not at fault, but somebody has to be. Mr. McKinney claims that he made a full stop at the light before entering the intersection and accused Miss Lang of not slowing down before the collision. Miss Lang claims that she braked before the collision and that Mr. McKinney did not stop at the flashing red light. Using force and momentum, work and energy, friction, conservation of momentum, and kinetics, I'll determine what really happened. Force is a pull or push on an object with relation to an interaction with another object. Mr. McKinney and Mrs. Lang experienced a contact force. This is formed from a direct interaction between two separate objects. A long-range force acts upon an object from a distance. Friction affects how far an object goes because it pulls it in the opposite direction. In this case, the friction coefficient was 70% of the car's tires. Conservation of momentum before a collision is the same after a collision, so they should add up. Kinematics is used to predict unknown information in an object in motion, which in this case are the vehicles. This will help us plug in to determine velocity, acceleration, and all unknown components. Coefficient of friction in kinetic form, the tire of the car was 130 newtons. The coefficient of the truck was 70% of the car. In order to drag the tire, the force would have had to have been 100 newtons. To figure out the mu frictional force, in other words, of both the truck and the car, we had to use the formula frictional force equals mu times normal force. 100 equals mu times 130 newtons. In order to find this, we had to divide 130 newtons by 100. We came out with 0.79. With the truck, we have the components. So we multiplied 0.7 times 1.1796. The results were 0.538. We then use that to find acceleration. Using frictional force equals ma, we found acceleration by plugging in frictional force for both and multiplying it by the mass of both. We concluded that, we didn't multiply it, we divided. We concluded that acceleration equals 5.27 meters per second squared. And in the truck and in the car, we concluded that acceleration equaled 7.54 meters per second squared. The velocity after the collision and the velocity before the collision did not match up with the claims that Mr. Lang and Mrs. Lang and Mr. McKinney claimed. We found out that the initial velocity that Mr. McKinney was going was 11.1 meters per second, which could not be true if he stopped completely at the red light. In Mrs. Lang's case, she did not